Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for arranging this beautiful meeting, which is, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure that we all share this idea. This is the dream of a scholar, because only people who are really interested in the topic are here sharing ideas in an absolutely free environment. And, many of you have probably been at places like the Renaissance Society of America, which is a beautiful framework, but we're so many people and it's so difficult to meet and talk the way we've been discussing all kind of things. I don't know how we ended up comparing Cromwell and Donald Trump, but all kind of ideas come to our minds.
I think I know how you did that.
I have to say that I'm also very glad to be with such a distinguished group of scholars, Moorian scholars. I am not one of them, I have to tell you that right from the start. I'm working on my paper will be on economy in utopia, but I did not get to study economy in utopia from an interest in Thomas More. It's just the other way around. I've been studying and examining economy in the early modern period, 16th and 17th centuries, and that's how I got to Thomas More utopia. So what I will try to do now is to make a reading of some of the economic references in both books of Utopia, and I will make that reading alongside other texts from the period, most of them English, but also a few references to some Spanish texts for reasons I will explain. And this is an ongoing thing, and so there are lots of loose ends, and I will probably find many of them. Thomas More's Utopia has been historically acknowledged by most scholars as a work openly expressing some concerns with economic issues, although these do not seem to have been as thoroughly and consistently examined as others. From a cursory look to different journals, we may see how few studies of specific economic aspects in Utopia there are in comparison to other aspects. To be sure, notions dealing with moral and religious attitudes, the social organization of a community, including legal and administrative concepts and processes, or the political role of kings and rulers, have been far more frequently studied and commented. Judging from the critical attention devoted to all these topics, one could conclude that to a certain extent at least, the economic characteristics of More's presentation of an ideal commonwealth are easy to grasp and unproblematic, or marginal and secondary, or both. However, any reader of Utopia cannot fail to notice that, as Jerry was saying, the economic issues are central to the work, because even the pretext for More's trip to Flanders, a trip we know that actually took place, was of an economic nature, a trade agreement as we were discussing in our lunch. But interestingly, More's approach to economy in his Utopia, when studied, has been alternatively considered to be unsystematic and consequently irrelevant to the work as a whole, or coherent and clearly suggesting the persistence of a residual medieval economic esteem, or articulated around early modern mercantilism, inclined towards so-called early Christian communism, or suggesting More's championing of proto or early capitalistic practices. And we cannot have it all these ways at the same time. Such diverse, mostly contradictory interpretations of the actual economic content of the text, communist or capitalist, medieval or early modern, are a consequence of, I am persuaded, three factors. The confusion of the narratorial voice with that of the main characters, namely Thomas More the author, as we were distinguishing, Thomas More the author and the character, Raphael Hithlowday, Cardinal Mortimer, so on and so forth. Second, the subordination of the actual text, as we read it today, or as we have been reading it throughout the 20th century, to the ideological agendas of those reading it from an economic perspective, like, just to give an example, the freshwater and saltwater schools of economic thought, the School of Chicago or Paul Krugman. And finally, the relative neglect of the economic examination of many texts, literary or not, from the 16th and 17th centuries. I will not approach the first of these factors. I do not intend to produce a stylistic analysis of Utopia, interesting and important as it is. And the ideological baggage of many economists approaching the text is not or should not be my concern here. But I do intend in this paper to approach some of the major economic ideas included and expressed in Utopia in order to examine them alongside other texts, as I said, similarly concerned with those issues, something which I believe has not so frequently, at least not to my knowledge, been attempted. The progressive development of new economic practices in early modern England, more so during the 16th and during the 17th century, created a degree of confusion, and your notion of permeability also made me think, that was articulated through various cultural artifacts. This includes not only plays and treatises, but also less frequently other texts, such as poems and emblems. And Thomas More's Utopia was not immune to the preoccupation. Value and worth, monopolistic practices, hoarding, devaluation, and inflation, and of course usury, to mention some of the most relevant and quickly expanding economic practices in the 16th century, perplexed, disturbed, and even enraged Elizabethans who found them incoherent. Indeed, 16th century English individuals could hardly understand how these concepts, or at least some of them, worked, and even perceived that these ideas were threatening and potentially dangerous for their own personal stability, and also for that of their own. One of the reasons was, of course, the difficult compatibility between a Christian and a capitalistic agenda, or nascent capitalistic. If on the one hand Christian teachings seem to favor a community of ownership and use, something which of course Plato's Republic, but also some Christian authors like Erasmus or Calvin in Geneva seem to endorse, the actual expansion of capitalist practices throughout the economy of the 16th century seemed to suggest that this community was not possible or desirable, just like, among others, Aristotle had predicted in his polemic with Plato's Republic. But how to justify morally and from a Christian perspective such concepts as profit-making or usury, and of course we'll know how Martin Luther ranted against the practice of usury in his essay on usury and also against the Jews. This was disturbing and controversial for 16th century Christians. According to Thomas Wilson in a discourse upon usury of 1572, according to Thomas Wilson's A Discourse upon Usury, 1572, usurers were marvelous, strange, and uncharitable. Wilson was, to be sure, reacting to the 1571 Usury Act, which passed by Queen Elizabeth, had legalized and regulated usury, repealing a regressive act of 1552, which only 1 year after Utopia had appeared in English, had forbidden as usurious moneylending at any interest without exception. The 1571 Usury Act then reintroduced de facto the more permissive Act of 1545, which allowed payment for credit with a maximum yearly rate charge of 10%. This decision was was a royal and a parliamentary concession to tradesmen and merchants who had repeatedly claimed that the total prohibition of credit was seriously damaging their activities. So this is the progress of the different laws banning and allowing usury. Interestingly, in 1552, money lending was forbidden at any interest. The expansion of trade and the introduction of new economic concepts and practices in the English 16th century, and more so in the increasingly globalized world of the 17th century, was eventually linked in England to the stability of the realm, eventually to the Anglican and Protestant state. This perception was soon enough dealt with by poets, emblematists, playwrights, and of course essayists, who seem to have picked some of More's preoccupations as expressed in Utopia. Also, emblems like those with an economic content in Geoffrey Whitney's Choice of Emblems, published in 1586 in Leiden, or those by Henry Beecham in his 1612 Minerva Britannica, or treatises such as Thomas Mann's England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, 1630, in which even usury is considered potentially beneficial for the Commonwealth, or Roger Fenton's A Treatise on Usury, 1611, among many others. All these texts clearly explain the extent of the concern with an interest in economy. These are some of the most interesting works dealing with the notion. And of course, Gerard de Molins, in celebrating England's view in the unmasking of two paradoxes, 1603, seems to have set the tone by simultaneously opposing money as a form of private gain and also advocating government rules to ensure that money worked for the Commonwealth, which may or did sound incompatible. Neglecting the concern for the public, that is common good, and embracing private gain was something against which, long ago, Ovid had already warned his readers in that most seminal of Western poems, the Metamorphoses. For Ovid, it was during the evil age of iron that, and I quote, the ground itself, which once had been common to all, like sunlight on the air, fell under the surveyor's drawn-out lines. Ovid seems to be criticizing that greed of gain that Torquato Tasso, the Italian poet, was referring to in his pastoral drama Aminta, 1572. According to Ovid, the Golden Age was golden precisely because they didn't know gold. Furthermore, Ovid feared in the first book of his Metamorphoses what he described as the ground falling, I quote again, under the surveyor's drawn-out lines, the common ground. In other words, what Tudor England should know as enclosures. The perfect example that came to show how private gain was replacing the common good in 16th century England. The absence of gold and of enclosures.
Oh, sorry.
Are, of course, two of the more frequently quoted characteristics of Raphael's criticism of England and description in Utopia. According to Hiddleday in Book 1, enclosures in England are destroying the economy of families. He says, your English sheep devour men themselves. In an interesting paradox, the sheep eating people. And the consequences are poverty and criminality, as we know. The text shows a good understanding of this all too real problem. Raising sheep was producing in England high returns, high profits for English landlords, and this led them to enclose increasingly bigger plots of land. So farmers saw their lands diminish or even disappear, and unemployed became vagabonds and occasionally criminals. Of course, in his major work, The Capital, Karl Marx identified the violent deprivation of common lands from farmers, and more specifically early modern enclosures, which he mentions, with the primitive accumulation of capital and the origins of the capitalist labor market. Like Marx, Morse Hiddleday seems to fear the consequences that these kinds of actions by the powerful will have for the weaker members of the community. And of course, hence the connections with communism that were so popular in the 1950s. Also, as a consequence of diminishing farming land, the text explains, food prices started to rise, and they actually started to rise in 16th century England. And it consequently became more difficult for impoverished farmers to feed their families. But this economic upheaval was not unprecedented. A medieval mentality could well anticipate this consequence. Of course, less food means higher prices, which reproduced the well-known law of supply and demand. Low supply and high demand increased price. Social unrest in England had to do not so much then with that situation, which they knew, as with opposition to land enclosures themselves as an expanding practice that farmers and peasants perceived as unfair in and of itself. But what was new now was another relatively unknown economic consequence. According to what the middleman knew, if there was an increase in the number of sheep producing wool, this had to mean that the price of wool should fall. That is, the greater the supply and the lower the demand, prices drop. This should allow unemployed farmers to purchase cheaper wool in order to make cloth, improving their state as manufacturers. However, this was not the case. The reason had to do, as Hiddleday knew, with the expansion of monopolistic practices, or as he more precisely called them, at least in the translation, all agree with using that term, oligopolies. The wool trade, he says, is concentrated in few hands, an oligopoly, you might say. Unquote. Morse's discussion of enclosures, then, does not only reflect on the nature of this new practice, evil and pernicious for the weaker sort, although certainly illegal, but on the unpredictable and mysterious nature of prices under fluctuation, not mechanically conforming to the well-known law of supply and demand. at least not any longer. To be sure, Book 2 of Utopia shows an even more insightful understanding of how prices evolve, suggesting a reduction in the production of goods in order to prevent inflation, for which More and Hitler seem to have no word. Edmund Spencer's De Feriquine, published from 1590, elaborated in the middle of its idealized world of knights and dragons and princesses, we all know so well, a serious reflection on the new role of money and gold in global systems of exchange and commerce. And he was, of course, specifically thinking of England. In Book 2, Canto 7 of the poem, Spencer tells the story of the encounter between Bouillon and Mammon, the god of wealth and money. The god of wealth explains to Bouillon and to Spencer's readers how immense wealth involves immense power, how the world is in many ways no longer ruled by principles, by faith, or by honorable actions, but by money, and how even the semi-divine nature of kings, their rise and fall, is constituted by wealth, its abundance, or its lack of. Bouillon, a consistent Christian knight with a rock-solid faith, blatantly rejects this unchristian offer from Mammon and resists the temptation represented by Mammon and his wealth. But what interests me here is the nature and use of Mammon's wealth. As it seems, Bouillon is surprised that this wealth is hidden from view and never used. What art thou, man, if man at all thou art? He says to Mammon, that here in desert hast thine inhabitants, and these rich heaps of wealth dost hide apart from the world's eye and from her right usance. Of course, my emphasis. Morse Hitler had already, a few decades earlier, expressed the exact same concern. In Book 1 of Utopia, he explains how the king of the Macarians, a people who live not far from the Utopians, we are informed, never keeps, and I quote, in his treasury at any one time more than 1,000 pounds of gold, or its equivalent in silver, as a barrier against any king heaping up so much money as to impoverish his people. Exactly what Mammon is doing. So hoarding, heaping up gold, amassing wealth, is exactly the opposite of what a capitalist economy needs, and already in the early 16th century it had become apparent for More that money had to be put to right usance, as Spencer's character expressed it. And hence the Macarians' restriction on the amount of gold their king, like Spencer's Mammon, can hoard. But if according to More's Utopia gold had to be put to good use, it should circulate, certainly one of the uses of, or usances Utopians gave to gold should surprise readers of More. And probably we all know what I'm talking about. And I quote, chamber pots and stools are made of gold and silver in Utopia, we are told. Hitler explains in Book 2, even more shockingly, that, and I quote, the chains and heavy fetters of slaves are also made of these metals. So the chains and the fetters are made of gold. Leaving aside the economic implications of slave labor, which of course was a very important economic element in 16th century England, and with which I cannot deal in any detail here, we may consider one of the reasons behind such an extravagant use for gold, to which I will immediately return. English emblem books of the 16th and 17th centuries frequently passed an ambiguous judgment on the anti-acquisitive position derived from the writings of, among others, Virgil, Seneca, or Ovid, to which I briefly referred earlier. Among others, Geoffrey Whitney's 1586 Choice of Emblems, which was based on Andrea Alciato's Emblematum Liber of 1531, and from which it actually lifted actual emblems, included an emblem that interestingly captures, although in a different manner, More's idea of shackles made of gold. Emblem number 202 in Whitney's Choice of Emblems is entitled Aurea Compedes, golden shackles. And it is a direct reproduction of Alciato's 87th emblem in Aulicos, or against courtiers. And it has this pictura. The epigram, well, of course, there's no color, but I can guarantee they are golden shackles. And the epigram explains. And though that some prefer their bondage for their gains, and richly are adorned in silks and pressed with massive chains, yet many others live that are accounted wise, who liberty do chiefly choose, though clad in guns of Christ. And if I should be asked, which life doth please me best, I like the golden liberty, let golden bondage rest. Here Whitney introduces the perplexing perception that gold may allude to contradictory and even incompatible meanings, exemplified in the emblems concluding and opposing golden liberty and golden bondage. Significantly, and as we saw, More had already emphasized the latter, the use of gold literally to enchain people, devising a right use for gold as the evil substance binding men and preventing their proper moral development. This contradiction in the approach to gold is reproduced in relation to wealth and money. Both were in More's England similarly desired and condemned, since there was a strong perception that gold, and money specifically, had an ambiguous nature, which made them fluctuate mysteriously, and also an awareness that value and worth were different things. As a matter of fact, utopian economics make it very clear that for them, gold has an intrinsic value, which is inferior to that of iron, we are told, but also we have face value, which is reserved for foreign trade or import, hence the permeability, the connection with the outer world. Hitler explains that utopians, and I quote, "Utopians take care that no one shall overvalue gold and silver, of which money is made, beyond what the metals themselves deserve." Deserve is the important word here. This allusion to deserve involves a whole economic theory. The value of coins depending on, for one thing, the amount of gold that they have, their intrinsic or incardinated value, but also on economic processes beyond the control of the individual, such as devaluation or inflation, which gave them their value of use or their face value. This concern is more important than it may appear at first sight, and I am persuaded signals More's ambivalent attitude towards 16th century economic processes. In Spain, to which I will only briefly refer, which happened to be the wealthiest as well as the most inflationary economy in the Western world then, by the 16th century, scholars of Salamanca had already realized that geography, or space as they called it, and time affected the value of money, especially bullion currency and gold. In other words, value, as Hitler seems to grasp, is not an essential or intrinsic quality of coins, but is determined by exchange and, he says, human folly. The reason is that, disturbingly enough, golden coins are not wealth in themselves, but commodities, their value depending on their scarcity or their abundance, and hence the importance of controlling in some way their stability and the unsettling nature of early modern money. This makes utopians prefer a money-less society. Utopian practices expose the absurdity of monetary policies through the contrast between intrinsic and face value, or the problematization of the value and consequently worth of bullion itself. Hitler provides an example of how those in power may tamper, may play with the stability of coins and money in order to engross the riches. Suppose the councillors of some other king are discussing various schemes for raising money to fill his treasury. One man recommends increasing the value of money when the king pays his debts, and devaluing it when he collects his revenues. Thus he can discharge a huge debt with a small payment, and collect a large sum when only a small one is due to him. Well, that's a possibility. That More's utopia was very clearly picturing one of the major concerns of those disturbed or worried with nascent capitalism may be clearly perceived from a variety of texts. I will mention just one, which, influenced by the school of Salamanca, and probably by More himself, instructed against monarchs altering the value of money and coins. The Jesuit Andrés Mendo, in his ample book Príncipe Perfecto y Ministros Ajustados, Documentos Políticos y Morales, published in 1657, dedicated emblems to economic issues. Among them, emblem 47, in which Mendo reproduces the image of a coin showing Emperor Constantinus kneeling, with the emblems inscriptio placed around the coin's edge. Monete probitas et veneratio, that is, excellence and veneration of money. Sorry, not so clear as I would like. But rather than suggesting, as it could look, a pagan worship of money, with the Emperor Constantinus kneeling before a coin, Mendel, like More, warns against those rulers who, like in Hitler Day example, try to interfere with the value of coins, which disturbs trade and also the kingdom. Mendel says, con el comercio se conserva la abundancia y para él es necesaria la buena ley en la moneda, which means through trade, plenty is kept, and it is for trade that no deviation from legal standard is required. Hence the reference to Constantinus, since the emblem stresses his legendarily wise monetary policy, which successfully confronted in Rome the same disease that was afflicting Spanish, and to a certain extent English, economy. That is, the price revolution, the so-called price revolution of the early 16th century, with Henry VIII's great debasement. Henry VIII, as you know, was nicknamed Copper Nose, because he took away silver from the coins, he made them from copper, and the metal on his nose, which was more prominent, would go away, showing the copper behind the silver. It was a disaster. The Great Debasement was an absolute economic disaster. The subscriptio of Mendo's emblem explains how mandó labrar una moneda el emperador Constantino, alluding to how, by issuing his golden solidus, the coin that he created, Constantinus avoided tampering with money and coins and could successfully remedy the inflation that afflicted the empire since the times of Diocletian. Like in More's ideal state, the Commonwealth requires la bondad y estabilidad de la moneda, that is, the probity and the stability of currency, rather than monarchs playing or tampering with currency like King Henry did in the 1540s. To conclude, More's Utopia offers the reader, among so many other ideas, a serious reflection on economy in 16th century England. I'll just try to show a few of them. More was no economist, yet he was well aware of some of the major problems that England's society was confronting in economic terms. And his position was not that of a convinced capitalist, as some would like to think, or a residual medieval mind, or an advocator of communism. More's views show, I have tried to argue, the concerns and preoccupations of a man of the early 16th century, witnessing the expansion, the disturbing expansion, of early or nascent capitalism. Against enclosures and concerned with the instability of money, and disturbed by the paradoxical nature of gold, which he knew was necessary but also dangerous, More's Utopia seems to reproduce the well-known conflict between residual and dominant structures of feeling surrounding the evolution of capitalism in England and elsewhere, while pointing at the eventual emergence of the so-called disturbing new economy. Thank you.